Today I think that we could take a look at the idea of meditation. It's not really a word I've used very much because it's aligned so much with the East and sitting in a certain posture and, in a sense, a kind of introspection and working towards, you might say, higher states of consciousness or higher states of self and illumination. Not that those things don't have value. I think they're going on in all of our lives. I think we're all, by implication, involved in meditation of some kind. I mean, in the dictionary, meditation is really to ponder. So it's a kind of in-depth looking. You could call it an in-depth understanding, an in-depth inquiry, self-inquiry, self-examination, self-reflection. You could say the state of a child is meditation without too much consciousness, which is an obstacle to meditation in its pure essence. But of course there's no recordings of children's experience. I mean, there are allusions to certain mythological deities, as it were, being fully aware at a very early age. And I think I had an experience before I was 2 years old of a sense of being in a certain light, in the sense of a divine child. And that had a mythological, symbolic context to do with my family tree, which you could say is to do with the life story of my ancestors. And so I've worked on that a bit. I think it's really looking back into your life and trying to see meditation as I would say moments of SATORI, moments of enlightenment that are so subtly different from any other form of experience that I think if you were able to talk to people intimately, I think that you could call it moments of grace, moments of beneficence, moments of guidance, moments of insight, moments of some level of presence, revelation, etc. I think it's all around us basically, but for matters of definition, it's really what people talk about in books. I mean, I never spoke to my family about meditation. I've not really spoken to many people actually about meditation. You know, if you think of all the great minds like Einstein, Plato, Newton, people that discovered very deep things in music and art and literature, philosophy, mysticism, I think they would have touched some profound level of meditation. Because when you enter that kind of level, as it were, in Tibetan Buddhism, then you acquire Bodic insight. So that means with the third eye you can see through the veil of illusion, Maya, which means you can take on any thought form, any aspect of knowledge, and penetrate right through to the essence. And then they speak about the higher level of nirvana as the Buddha essence. So you're really, in effect, seeing through the labyrinth of the brain, as it were, seeing through the process of thought itself and memory and knowledge, and going right to the threshold of nirvana. But in the West, probably in the West since the dawn of modern science in the Royal Society in the 17th century, the idea of talking about something transcendental, mystical, was out of favour, and religion gradually declined. Although someone like Newton, who discovered the law of gravity, he actually was interested in Rosicrucianism, alchemy, and thought that there were hidden codes within the Bible, and actually wrote about 1 million words on that inquiry. So it's still going on. And before that period, people that looked in depth into reality as a whole were known as natural philosophers, which I relate to the Latin sapient or sapientia, which means that people with discernment could divine the rules of wisdom or practical knowledge of the world. They were known as sages and philosophers. So before science, as it were, took over, which was very materialistic eventually, like people refer to a Renaissance person. That means you've got understanding, insight into lots of different things. And so a natural philosopher would naturally be interested in reality as a whole. So somebody like Plato, who wrote on every subject. When I did have my awakening at the age of 23, and became aware of a numinous presence in my life, which was both internal and external. So it's like one field. It was like a spiritual presence that enfolded the psychophysical. So, I call it the One. That moment of awakening, when the self becomes important, not the ego, when in the sense the self eclipses the dominant identity. So you can still function in the world, you can still do what you do, but you're looking at it from a different perspective. So I would say meditation begins, or is actually, not just begins, because it doesn't end, but is the moment of awakening. And that brings in spiritual awareness. So you could say the moment of awakening, the moment of enlightenment, SATORI, Samadhi, Nirvana, that moment is meditation. So in effect, if you stay with that sense of self, then you stay with the movement of a momentum of meditation. So you could say spiritual awareness is meditation, openness, simplicity, intelligence, Bodhic insight. And in one sense, once it's awakened, that light of understanding, that light of knowing the self, it doesn't go out. So I've never for one single moment ever forgot my sense of self and having its root in the spiritual dimension. That's always been with me. You know, if you're a mother over, you know, you're raising children over a 20-year period, in effect, 24/7, you're always the mother. I mean, the mother never forgets that it's the mother. Of course you're busy. I'm not talking about remembering in your memory. I'm not talking about wearing that label. I'm just saying that you don't forget. And if you're a poet, if you're an artist, you don't forget. And exactly the same way, if you discover the self as the essence of awareness, then you never forget. And in a sense, you're free. In essence, you're free. So meditation is a movement in freedom. And it doesn't belong anywhere. You can't analyze it with your consciousness. You can't define it. You can't locate it. Because it's emptiness. You know, be still and know that I am God type of thing, or the inner voice, or I mean, Jung refers to the self as the treasure hard to find, because no matter where you look, you won't find it. In consciousness, you can travel the world and read all the books, but unless it's given to you, unless it's a gift, a creative gift, as it were, just come, you know, the light shines on yourself, as it were. But because the self doesn't belong anywhere, then that's a mystery. If its source is nothing, then it's a mystery. No thing means beyond the boundary of knowledge, beyond the boundary of memory itself. So as I became awakened, as it were, and the world changed, and I felt I was in a kind of no man's land, which is quite a good description, because you've got the no, which is, you could say, the negation of memory, identity and consciousness and knowledge. They're in suspension, as it were. Then you are in the no man's land. And what are you going to do? What is self going to do in a place that it doesn't belong? It doesn't belong in the physical world, it doesn't belong in the psychic world. In other words, the self is not attached to a content of consciousness in terms of matter and mind. Where do you go? What do you do? Literally in daily life, I didn't know what to do. I left university, left a marriage, had this kind of, dropping out of the system, as it were. But of course, I didn't see it that way. I was taken over by a kind of disturbance. I thought there was some kind of element of illness. It was so radically different, and the organism had to respond to it. So the organism got a bit frightened, got confused, didn't know what was happening to it. And the doctor and the psychiatrist, they didn't help in any way. So I was just living in a room on my own. And I met this girl. She was an Irish American. She was a model from New York, very beautiful, kind of pre-Raphaelite girl. And she moved into the room next to me. And I'm just giving that as an example. I wasn't looking for her. Before that, I had been married, and then I'd been going to different clubs and things like that. But, she came into my life. I was already doing poetry, I was already doing art, and they just came of their own, but it is, those things are in my family. I'm trying to say that in meditation is non-specific. If it's freedom, if it's self-enquiry, then it's like going to the library, picking up a book and just opening the book and starting to read the book. You have no idea what you're going to find. And that's exactly what it's like. I call reality the book of life. So when you come out of the one, out of pure enlightenment, as it were, into reality, then that's like a book of life. And the book of life contains your story. And I think your story goes on from the time you're born to the time you die. And it doesn't really matter whether you're fully aware of the story or not. But when you are awakened, then you're very much in touch with your story. And you want to know what it means. And you could say in meditation, the meaning is in the living. So in order to find out what it meant to relate to this girl, I had to live it. I couldn't think back, oh, how did I treat my wife and how did I relate to other girls? No, this was like an adventure. And of course, she was in a very similar state, actually, because she came away from New York, up the Hudson River, back to her home in Poughkeepsie, and she was at a loss. In fact, her brother had been killed in Vietnam, so she was in a slightly distressed state, but she was all right. But you could tell that she was having a breakdown as well. I had a kind of breakdown, and she was having a kind of breakdown. And obviously there was a sympathy. And I remember we went around, we went into different clubs. I remember her favourite song on the jukebox. When we used to go in, she'd always play Baby Light My Fire by The Doors. And that was the kind of energy at that time. That was the kind of energy And I didn't know anything about hippies at that time. I didn't know about California and Haight-Ashbury, psychedelics and counterculture. I didn't know anything about that. I think she might have known something about that. She was much more into rock music. I was into classical music. No, she was very passionate and like learning things. We used to play the recorder. So as you're going about the world in this kind of no man's land, you don't have a prescription, you don't have preconceptions. So you see, if you're an artist, then you identify with other artists, and you're looking for that. You know, a man goes out to a club and he's looking for a woman. You go to university, you're looking for a career. If you're married, you're looking for children. I've been living with a family in high school, and the man was an inventor for IBM. It was an IBM town, and the son had gone off to Vietnam. So when I dropped out of university, I met him again in Poughkeepsie, and he took me out to see Timothy Leary, the psychedelic guru, at his house. Again, I didn't know anything about drugs or anything. But again, that just came into my life. It was like totally everything was unexpected. Him coming back from Vietnam, going to see Timothy Leary, meeting hippies, going across the river to New Paltz, living in a hippie kind of situation while I was studying art at the University of New Paltz, etc. And it was like one page after another. It was non-stop. So if you take meditation, it was pretty intense. It was very self-revealing, and I had to deal with all these new type of people, new type of books, new type of knowledge, new type of thought processes. And I never told anybody about my awakening. Nobody knew that the state I was in. And of course I had not read any books, so I didn't know I was in meditation. I didn't know I was spiritual. I didn't have any terminology because I wasn't raised as a religious person. So in my family there would have been no idea of God or soul or anything. So I was literally just a very secular, ordinary person. And meeting all these people that were turned on by Eastern religion and all of that, I had no idea about it. So I never told anybody. But what was quite humorous is that I got to know this guy that ran this small theatre, because New Paltz was a tiny, you know, in England we'd call it a big village. It wasn't even a town. I mean, it had no big shops or anything. It was just a main street, and it was a kind of suburbia, a main street with a few shops. Then you got the university, and not far away was the Adirondack Mountains, very notable for the Native American Indians, and there was Woodstock, and where the festival would be in the following year. And Woodstock was a country residence, as it were, for people from Greenwich Village in New York, where I'd happened to visit when I was in high school. And they would have their summer homes in Woodstock, and people like Bob Dylan had been there, and he was making music not far away, and that kind of thing. this guy that ran the theatre, I think it was before I met him, I was living in a house with 3 girls from the university, and I found out about the theatre and went to the theatre, and it was both a place where they actually were acting plays but also putting on movies. So the movie I went to see was The Yellow Submarine with the Beatles, a cartoon-like thing. But I wasn't into the Beatles, I didn't know much about the Beatles. And when I walked into the theatre, which held about, I don't know, 300, 400, 300 people, possibly. I mean, they're all hippies. I wasn't yet a hippie. They're all hippies, all spaced out on drugs. And it was just hilarious. It was just mind-blowing, actually, see all those people together freaking out. And just in front of me, I saw somebody I knew from high school. In fact, we were in the same fraternity. There's only one fraternity in the high school. It's fairly elite. And I was in that fraternity, and so was he. So I was glad to see him, because I didn't know anybody. I mean, I hadn't, I had no sense of anybody else. And yeah, I was glad to see him. I got to know the guy that ran the theatre, well, he owned the theatre. I used to hang out at his house. And he said, would I like to be in a play? And he said, would I like to play the Buddha? And I've never acted, and I don't like the idea of all those people staring at me, as it were, me as the Buddha, probably just sitting there. Of course, I'd not even known about the Buddha. At that time, I knew nothing about the Buddha. I mean, I wouldn't have equated my enlightenment with the Buddha, or that it had anything to do with the Buddha. I had no idea. But it's curious that he should say that. And I was in this state. And of course, I wasn't self-conscious about the state, so I wouldn't kind of go around thinking, oh, I'm in a special state. I just adapted to that state, and that felt natural, and it was just a part of me. That was my kind of my kind of rebirth into a new kind of world. I mean, at the age of 15, I emigrated to America to join my sister in New Hampshire, and within 3 months she went to California with her husband, and I was left alone. So I was used to adapting to quite challenging situations. So the idea that you're switching your identity from being English to being in America, then you've lost your family. And I was used to that kind of thing. I lived with several people, different families in high school, so I was well adapted to that kind of thing. And I've spent most of my life doing that. I've lived in hundreds of places, so I'm used to all of that. So I used to hang out in this particular bar, as it were, where they're very into rock and country rock music, and all the university people, all the local people that were alternative, hippies, psychedelic, they used to hang out there. And I was just sitting there, and this girl comes up to me, and it was an old girlfriend when I was in high school. We used to go out together and lost contact, and there she was. And I met this guy. I was 23, going on 24. He probably was more around 30. Wearing a black cape, and forget his name. And as I say, it was more or less a country town. It was very much the countryside. And he's living in the countryside. And I went to visit him. And he was painting very big paintings in the style of Monet. And Monet used to paint water lilies. That was his famous thing, Impressionist. And he'd paint all these water lilies, very beautiful blues and purples, and on this water, very serene. And he was doing something like that. He was doing something like that. And he'd been out to the east. So he's the first person I met that had been out to the east. Very into that kind of thing, meditation, everything. But at that time I hadn't met anybody practicing any particular meditation or spiritual practice. I was reading a book. I started reading one or two books, probably Lao Tzu's book, and I was reading Hermann Hesse, Narcissus and Goldmund. Well, Narcissus is a monk who just remains in the monastery, and Goldmund, you know, it's like in search of gold, as it were. Goldmund was a sculptor who travelled around Europe. He was on a kind of adventure, and he did these sculptures and such. And when I met this guy, I was about to come back to England and kind of, you know, to Europe, and this was the first synchronicity that actually impacted me. I mean, before that time, I didn't know what the word synchronicity meant at that time. And even coincidence, I wouldn't have registered something like that. But I said to him, you know, that he seemed like Narcissus now that he was settled and he wouldn't be leaving. And he was very monkish in a way. He's very, very, very quiet, very... he travelled. He wasn't like an introvert, but he was just quite happy painting his pictures. And I was about to go off to Europe and kind of a big adventure, and I was also doing sculpture, so it was very interesting. It was a very big synchronicity, but I didn't know Hermann Hesse was a close friend of Jung. I had no idea. But at that time, in that kind of meditation, as it were, I didn't think of recording anything. I didn't think of documenting anything. I didn't think, oh, this is a special state, I should write about it. I was very philosophical. I did well in philosophy in university, and also in comparative religion and things like that. But I never thought of thinking about the state I was in. So it was very much a non-thought situation for me. And even when I was reading these new books, as it were, I didn't really know what I was reading about. I didn't kind of have a background. And it wasn't until I returned to England the next year, just before the Woodstock Festival, that I read a couple of books that then really put me in perspective. In Search of the Miraculous by Uspensky, his meetings with Gurdjieff, and Lama Govinda's Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism. Those two books actually did give me a sense of what I was going through, the kind of inquiry, the kind of process, some of the results, some of the things that might happen in the future if you stay with this kind of meditation. But as I say, meditation to me is synonymous with the One and with freedom. So there is just this innate sense of freedom, and you go where it takes you. But that doesn't mean to say you're going blind. I mean, you may not know much about it, but know that you've got a sense of self, you've got a sense of meaning, and as I say, the meaning is in the living of it, the reading the book, meeting the people, going from place to place. You know, you're not checking everything. You're not saying, well, this will lead to this, and this will lead to a career, and this will lead to, you know, a predictable future. No, it wasn't like that at all. So there was an incredible sense of creativity, freedom, openness. I got on a plane in New York and flew over to Amsterdam, and I got off the plane, went to a square in Amsterdam, just met this German girl, spent the day with her, and then made my way to England. And when I arrived in England, and I was in London getting off the train, these two men came over and wanted to know who I was and what I was doing. And they, you know, because I looked like a hippie, they thought I was carrying drugs or something. I had no idea what they were doing. I'd never had any encounter like that. It was quite funny. I mean, you know, you're not self-conscious of what you look like. I've never been self-conscious. So, I mean, I happen to be wearing clothes that look like a hippie. Now I'm wearing clothes that are very conservative. It doesn't make any difference to me. But it amuses me that they see they see a label, and they attach all these definitions to the label. It's like my state of mind. I mean, you know, certain people find out, you know, that you don't have a fixed identity, and you're in meditation, etc., and they think that what's going on? They think something's wrong, you know, like that's not normal. Well, it's not abnormal, but it's certainly not normal. So in a short time I'm off to India, because I'd met this guy in England and he had a guru. But it wasn't a guru in an ashram. It was just an individual Indian man. And he was in the line of Meher Baba. And he's supposed to be an avatar. And this guy was known as Baba in Silence. He lived in the Himalayas, in Simla, which is a lot of places in the Himalayas, or the foothills of the Himalayas, because when you go higher and higher to the real Himalayas, I mean, they're right in Tibet and around that area. But he lived in the Himalayas, so if you go to Delhi, that's in what you call the plains, just flat land. And then you go 50 miles or something north, and then you come to the foothills, and there's no main road or anything. There's all these like almost tracks, you know, these roads are almost tracks. And there is a train that goes in certain parts. But he lived in Simla, and he took a vow of silence. So, you know, when I actually met him in England once, down in Devon, near Dartmoor. Came over for a while, and I was staying with my friend at the time down there, and he wrote everything down. So if you talked to him, he'd write everything down. And then I visited him on my own in London. He was staying with this lady in London, and she was out, and I went for lunch, and he cooked me this curry lunch. And yeah, there was a certain presence, there definitely was a certain shared awareness there. But I wasn't, at that time, in the very early 70s, I wasn't thinking of myself in any particular way. You know, for example, I wasn't empowered to represent myself, say as a spiritual teacher or something like that, or oh, I've achieved this state. I wasn't then categorizing anything at all. I just enjoyed being free and natural and just going from place to place, and everything was an adventure. That's how I liked it. So I wasn't really interested in teaming up with anybody or joining anything, etc. And anyway, I'd read Lama Govinda's book, and I went to visit him, and I actually ended up staying next door in a place called Almora. And Almora is in the corner of Nepal and Tibet, because he had come out of Tibet with the Dalai Lama when the Chinese came in, and the Dalai Lama went further into the foothills near Simla in Dharamsala, in Kulu Valley, which I later went to. I actually went there. My friend was actually staying there. So I attended seminars at Lama Govinda's house, but nothing took. I just didn't. I didn't seem to not make sense, but I didn't seem to be listening. I didn't seem to be interested in what was being said. Although I maybe should have been interested. That's why I went out there. I mean, when I left England, I said that I would be going probably for 10 years, and I would meet someone who could like help me understand the journey, as it were. But I had no specific thing in mind. And when I reflect back, I really wish I had probably communicated my state of mind to the Lama, and even became a Tibetan Buddhist. And that's another timeline. I mean, there's been so many timelines in my life. You know, I could have been this, so many. Could have been a professor, could have been a notable writer published by Oxford University Press. All these golden opportunities, I more or less negated, rejected every one of them for this no man's land. So I just left where I was living near the Lama, and just went off, and just literally didn't know where I was going. I stayed in some temples, and I used to like drawing in pencil. I did drawing in pencil in a black book. It was a Dala book. They're the company Dala, and it's very nice drawing paper. So I always used a Dala black book. And I had that with me, and I was doing a few drawings, and one of the drawings was of a young person, much young, no, not 23, much younger actually, but kind of a youth, you might say a youth, and just showing the upper part of the body naked. I was just wearing a cloth. I actually bought a cloth, and I was just wearing a piece of cloth around my body. That's all I was wearing, kind of one piece of cloth, and you bind it around your body, and then you tie it around your neck. So it's just hanging around your body, actually. And for a long time I was going barefoot, and then I got something for my feet. But I did this drawing, and it was, as I say, a young man, and then the bottom part of the body was actually a serpent. Well, yes, I'd read Lama Govinda's book, but I hadn't made any connection with the Kundalini. I didn't think in symbols. I wasn't thinking that way. But again, I wish I'd shown him, I wish I'd shown him and he'd get an idea of what state I was in. But I didn't know about that. And I was aware. It was a very beautiful place. I mean, you could see for miles, like 50, 100 miles. I mean, it was crystal clear weather. And you could see the top of the 4th highest mountain in the world. Now, you couldn't see the mountain at all except the very peak, the top peak, with all the snow. And this was in the middle of this was like bright, hot summer. And it was sticking up in the air, so if you imagine high up in the sky was the peak of this mountain, and then there were a few clouds and you couldn't see the base. It was very peculiar, very mystical, extremely mystical. And I was wondering about seeing very interesting people, a lot of so-called holy men, sadhus in the temples, and no cars, no roads, nothing like that, and just local people in their dress. The men used to wear white with a little black hat and the black waistcoat, and the women wore this beautiful green top and blue skirt, long skirt. I mean, really beautiful. And I don't quite know how it happened, when it happened, but as I say, in terms of meditation, there seemed to be a profound deepening. There definitely seemed to be a deepening of my first awakening. So you could say from my awakening, I was living in this no man's land. And I was still very in touch with consciousness. I could function all right in the world. Everything was all right, even though my identity, my ego, was rather, kind of like delicate. But it didn't bother me psychologically. I didn't feel threatened by it. And then this shift, quite a deep level shift. So if the other state was shadowy, slightly numinous and mysterious, this really went deep, and I from then on refer to it as the void, and that's certainly talked about in Lama Govinda's book. And I think it was the only word that stood out for me, apart from the bodhisattva. That idea, it impressed me as well. The idea that if you go into the visionary realm of the Buddhas, when you become a Buddha, but in the lower level of enlightenment, maybe the kind of enlightenment I might have been in, and then the higher is going fully into nirvana, fully awakened. So you're very aware of the world as the bodhisattva, Buddha bodhisattva, and you have compassion for the world, and you can also emanate what they call gift waves or grace waves. So many spiritual teachers become spiritual gurus when they die in the visionary realm, and they can send messages into your dreams, into your psyche, and maybe create revelations and synchronicities, something that's going to like transmit deeper level knowledge from the visionary realm. So I came upon this, the sense of losing the memory is what I first remember, that, you know, obviously the memory was functioning, and I didn't have to think about who I was. I mean, I knew my background, and I knew, you know, I'd been to university, I knew I was creative and all of that, but I didn't give it a thought. I was just kind of going about and not feeling insecure, and just feeling very secure in myself in this meditation, in this spiritual awareness. And then this sense of memory loss, as it were. And I literally had to think, oh, I'm David and I'm from England. I literally had to like talk to myself to keep that memory operating. So that was shifting. And then you could say the void is a sense of a kind of background, an inner background that was, you know, black, in the sense I'm using the term black, which was literally void of content. So it was almost like you were stepping into something, or yourself was entering something very, very profound and quite terrifying. And I was managing all right. I didn't know what it was. Again, I could have talked that over with the Lama, but I didn't. And eventually I did come back to England, and when I came back to England, which was like reconnecting, you could say, with my background, you know, literally coming back to England reconnected me with my memory, and I went into a kind of heightened awareness of ecstasy, profound sense of peace, and an inner silence. So when I mixing with my friends who were into Arthurian legend and spirituality and all of that in England, I didn't want to say anything. I was very silent. They'd come to see me, etc. Even the girlfriend that I had there before, she came to see me, and I wasn't interested, you know. Yeah, I was interested in her as a person, but not sexually. And I just, again, that became natural. That was another level added to it, and it became very natural. And I read a book called The Cloud of Unknowing, a mystical, anonymous mystical text. I think it's possibly medieval. And it talked about the mystic wanting union with God, with the Godhead. And this cloud was between the mystic. So all the mystic could do, you might say, is stay close to the cloud, as it were. And I don't think it mentioned the void, but that would be that's the kind of thing it would be. So you stay close to the void. And of course that's being close to nirvana and the one light of the clear mind. So when I came, you might say, out of the void, I did have this clarity of mind. I had this kind of inner silence. And so you could say they're kind of a sense of grace, a sense of, you know, a gift, as it were. And through that book, I actually ended up several months in an Anglican monastery called the Servants of the Will of God. There are about 4 monks there, and I just stayed there. I used to do some work in the woods, very lovely place, and used to read books on spirituality, mainly to do with the mystics and the spiritual fathers and levels of meditation, that kind of thing. And when I came out of that, I reconnected to my friends who invited me to go with them to see Krishnamurti, and I didn't know who he was. And in a sense, that was the kind of beginning of a new phase. So it's moving into a completely new phase. And that new phase, I would say, beginning in 1971, was a phase of clarity. So you could say the clear light of the one mind. It was a form of clarity. And when I connected with Krishnamurti, there certainly was a shared sense of clarity, and I had certain experiences in conjunction with him over the years, and I more or less used to go for the yearly conference from 71 until he died in 86. And during that time I met Professor David Boehm, read his book Wholeness in the Implicate Order, had conversations with him, and I could have become quite a close friend. He invited me to meet him in London at his house, and he was Professor Quantum Physics at the Birkbeck College, London University. And I mean, I've talked about Krishnamurti in another program, but I'd say through the 70s, I was quite spaced out, as it were, and I didn't need to analyze anything. I didn't need to kind of keep a record. I didn't need to think about anything. And Krishnamurti, although he was talking to Professor Boehm about levels of insight, levels of cosmic consciousness, made loads of videos on that at Brockwood Park, the school, and I got to know the principal, Dorothy Simmons, and I'd be staying there quite a lot during the year. And I mean, they were having dialogues about how to understand the deeper nature of what science was touching on in the quantum field and that kind of thing, non-locality, and related to telepathy, and you might say shared consciousness, global consciousness, that kind of thing. And quite frankly, at the end of that kind of inquiry, or my moving away from that, I finally settled for the idea that Krishnamurti, from his theosophical days, was probably cultivating an altered state of mind. That's my conclusion about Krishnamurti. And I've never although I've studied altered states of mind in depth, I've always distinguished the spiritual sense of oneness in terms of nirvana from altered states. So even something like cosmic consciousness is, I consider, a form of altered state. And talking about any form of consciousness, even the Jungian unconscious, I see that as altered states. Jung used to cultivate active imagination, which is a kind of meditation, but it involves thought, and it involves going into your mind and meeting various entities, mythological gods and so forth and so on. So I've never really practiced anything like that, and I've never practiced any formal meditation. So my meditation from the very beginning has always been a sense of freedom from knowledge, freedom from any form of identification with altered states. I think Krishnamurti had a sense of satori, of emptiness, nirvana, but I think that predominantly in the way he communicates, I think he's interested in, you might say, identifying the state he's in and the way he writes about it. I think he's saying to his audience, to his followers, that there is this special state of mind and it's worth seeking. And he's trying in his talks to guide you. Although he says there's no path, he is trying to influence you and guide you, and spent 30 years travelling the world and years talking to David Bowie about all the ins and outs of consciousness and mind and body and all of that. Whereas for me it's been very simple. I've never mixed up my inquiry into mythology with my freedom. Now, why I got involved in synchronicity, Jung, magic, Egyptian mythology, why I got involved with that is, to me, still a mystery. That happened in 1980, and I've only recently come out of that inquiry into self-knowledge in about 2014, and then preparing the books I published on Amazon. But in 2015, in the summer, I had a long period of very full-blown satori. Now, as I say, I was in satori about 90%, because if you go into 100%, I assume then that you go from what I call the immanent, the embodied sense of satori in the here and now, into the transcendental level of a fully fledged Buddha, as it were, which I haven't actually experienced. But I kept a record of that in my book One Mind, a journal of my experiences. So I've always distinguished between the kind of essential freedom that spiritual awareness, meditation, satori gives you as oneself, in touch with the one. So the world is one, the universe is one. That's not the same as saying cosmic consciousness, because the one goes beyond any concept, any location. So you wouldn't say cosmic consciousness. So this inquiry into my life story, into my actual bloodline, my ancestral bloodline that goes right back to Egypt, as it were, that kind of inquiry, what is like a life story or even a life review, because Buddha was said to have had a life review about his past lives. So I assume it's the same thing. And he certainly, well, it was said in Tibetan Buddhism that he had two teachers, and then he was an ascetic for 5 years. So there's definitely this sense that you go back into your past life, whether in this one life or in other lives, and you review it. And upon his enlightenment, he was visited by a Naga, and the Nagas are the initiates of wisdom, which shows that he's part of that lineage. And they were the Aboriginal serpent kings of India before the Aryans, before civilization, and the Hindus. And that's true universally, globally. The serpent kings are indigenous to every religion, every magical system. And as I say, in the Himalayas, I drew a kind of image of myself with a serpent's tail, and I've had endless Kundalini experiences, and that my my actual bloodstone, the garnet carbuncle, is actually the third eye. So it's very written into my lineage, but I can't give you an answer, or I can't give myself an answer to why I had to do that. If I was in this other state, I don't know why I had to do that. But Jung would say, in the process of self-knowledge, you have to integrate the shadow, integrate the anima, integrate the various entities and gods that visit you, that are revealed to you, in order to individuate, which in Tibetan Buddhism would be that you become an individual in nirvana, a free individual, and you more or less drop the kind of level of consciousness, the conditioning Maya, which would include all identification with your past, with any identity of the past, with any form of knowledge, even with the earth itself, because you go into this other dimension. So yeah, there's many ways to look at what I've had to do. As I say, since 2014, I haven't been involved with that. So I'm still learning, and I'm still in a state of not knowing what's next. I literally don't know what's next, where I will go, who I will meet, what I will say, what my position will be. I have no idea. But I could say basically it doesn't matter. I mean, in the sense of my kind of inner freedom, that's really all that matters to me personally, the sense of inner freedom and being an individual. And being at one with the world. I mean, you have to deal with consciousness on an everyday level. But that doesn't compromise my freedom. And I make sure that I don't get into situations where that freedom, well, the freedom can't be threatened, the freedom can't be taken away, but your life can become miserable if you got into the wrong kind of conditions. So you've got to be wise to the psychology of the world, you've got to be wise to the kind of parameters of science and what's going on technologically and psychosocially and politically. All of that is certainly a problem to address, as a spiritual person, what actually is going on in the world, and whether the future of mankind, as it were, or humankind, is going in the wrong direction, the right direction. But I don't see a comparison between, say, the people that are spiritual going in that direction, if that's what they're doing, and other people want to go in another direction. I don't find a problem in that, and I don't want to take on the role of saving anything, protecting anything. I mean, people like my parents, they lived and died and they lived their life, and I don't feel ultimately responsible for them, and ultimately that they should adopt what I do. So all through my life, my family, I've never brought my level of awareness into their life. I mean, I used to talk to my mother about things and everything, but fundamentally, I just leave people alone, and if I happen to meet people, I talk on whatever level I have to, and so forth and so on. And if they want to go deeper, they go deeper. If they don't, it doesn't bother me. And I mean, like anybody else, I listen to music, I watch films, entertainment, various things like that. I like clothes, I like fashion. So what? Okay. I think that's enough.